The era of colonization fundamentally transformed the globe, and with it, the global food system. But in this video, I'm not going to get into the history of colonization and its broader impacts. I have other videos on that topic if you're interested in exploring it more. Instead, I want to focus on the impact of colonization on food. It's an interesting topic, so let's get to it. The global trade in food, and especially trade in spices, predates the so-called Age of Discovery. The global trade in food, and especially in spices, predates the so-called Age of Discovery by millennia. Indeed, there is considerable evidence that Neolithic communities engaged in local trade of seeds, breeding livestock, and spices, especially salt, shortly after the advent of agriculture about 10,000 BCE. The earliest recorded mention of trading in spices was recorded by the Egyptians, documenting their trade with the land of Punt, believed to be modern-day Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Sudan, around 3000 BCE. That trade saw Egyptian grains, wine, and manufactured goods exchanged for aromatic resins, frankincense and myrrh, exotic woods, and animals from Punt. Around 1500 BCE, the Austronesian people of the islands of Southeast Asia established trade networks that connected Southeast Asia with regions as far east as the Hawaiian Islands, Easter Island, and New Zealand, and as far west as Madagascar, trading valuable spices like cloves, nutmeg, and mace originating on those islands, as well as marine resources like shells, pearls, sea cucumbers, and fish for textiles, ceramics, metal, tools, and weapons. In the first millennia BCE, a robust trade network connected the Arabs, Phoenicians, and Indians, permitting the trade of spices, gold, precious stones and metals, and other luxury goods from the Red Sea across the Indian Ocean. The Roman Empire, which lasted from 27 BCE to 476 CE, maintained extensive trade networks across Europe, Asia, and Africa. That trade network enabled the importation of spices like pepper, cinnamon, frankincense, and myrrh, silks and textiles from China, the precious metals, gems, and exotic animals from Africa and Asia to Rome. The import of grain from Egypt and North Africa was essential to maintain the large urban population of the Roman Empire. Indeed, the decline of grain imports to Rome was one of several factors that contributed to the decline and ultimate collapse of the Roman Empire. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, centered in modern-day Turkey, became the center of the spice trade, connecting Asia and Europe. Given its strategic location on the Silk Road and the Red Sea, it dominated trade, with spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger being highly valued for their use in cooking, medicine, and religious ceremonies. The rapid rise of the Islamic caliphates in the 7th century gave them control over key land and sea trade routes connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe, and allowing them to facilitate the flow of spices and a variety of other trade goods across the region. Major cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo became thriving commercial centers for the spice trade. At the broadest level, though, all of these trade networks centered on two broad routes, which have been labeled the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean trade. The Silk Road is the name given to the land routes that connected East Asia, primarily China, and the Mediterranean world. It spanned thousands of miles, traversing diverse terrains like deserts, mountains, and grasslands. Using caravans of camels and horses, traders moved a variety of goods, including silks, spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cardamom, precious stones, and metals from China across Asia and the Middle East to Europe and back again. But the Silk Road also facilitated the cultural exchange between different civilizations, as ideas, religions, technologies, and artistic styles traveled along the Silk Road, enriching the cultures and regions it connected. The Indian Ocean trading network encompassed the maritime routes that connected East Africa, the Middle East, India, South Asia, and China. It utilized the monsoon winds to facilitate navigation and trade. The Indian Ocean trade network was primarily known for the exchange of spices like cloves, nutmeg, and mace from Southeast Asia, but it also facilitated trade in other goods like textiles, ivory, timber, precious stones, and even enslaved peoples. And like the Silk Road, the Indian Ocean trade fostered cultural exchange between diverse societies, resulting in the spread of religions like Islam and Hinduism, the exchange of culinary traditions, and the development of new artistic styles. But while the Indian Ocean trade and the Silk Road were important trade routes, the scope of trade remained incredibly limited as geographical barriers and technological limitations hindered long-distance travel and transportation. The origins of spices and the routes they traveled were often shrouded in mystery and legend. This created an aura of exoticism and allure around these commodities, further fueling demand and driving up prices. As a result, trade goods were very expensive, and their consumption remained a status symbol reserved for the wealthiest and most powerful in society. However, all of this would begin to change with the so-called Age of Discovery and the era of colonization. The earliest part of this period was really a continuation of the spice trade that preceded it, with European powers, particularly Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands, driven by the desire to access valuable spices like pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. These spices were highly prized, not only for their ability to preserve and flavor food, but also for their use in medicine and religious rituals. As a result, they were incredibly valuable and could fetch high prices in European markets, making them a lucrative commodity. The quest for spices thus led to significant maritime exploration during the 15th and 16th centuries, as Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama navigated around the Cape of Good Hope to reach India, aiming to establish sea routes that bypassed the overland routes controlled by Middle Eastern and Venetian traders. Spanish explorers, including Christopher Columbus, similarly sought alternative routes to the spice-rich East by sailing westward. Indeed, it was Columbus's desire to find a new route to Asia that led to his accidentally discovery of the Americas in 1492. Columbus's arrival in the Americas sparked the widespread transfer of plants, animals, human populations, and disease between the Americas, West Africa, and the Old World. This process is often referred to as the Columbian Exchange and profoundly reshaped the world's biological and cultural landscapes. Through the Columbian Exchange, crops like maize or corn, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, squash, pumpkins, beans, peppers, chocolate, avocado, peanuts, and others migrated from the Americas to Europe and Africa, fundamentally transforming local cuisines and cultures. At the same time, wheat, rice, sugarcane, coffee, bananas, citrus fruit like oranges and lemons, grapes, olives, and apple trees all migrated from the Old World to the New. But the Columbian Exchange was not limited to just crops. It also included the migration of animals like horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, and chickens from the Old World to the New, and turkey from the Americas to Europe. And it resulted in the global movement of disease, with smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, malaria, and yellow fever moving from Europe to Africa and the Americas, decimating the indigenous populations there, and syphilis moving from the Americas to Europe. This massive exchange of genetic information had a variety of profound impacts. The introduction of new crops and livestock led to agricultural revolutions and transformed diets and cuisines around the world. Maize and potatoes became staple crops in many parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia, contributing to population growth. Tomatoes transformed culinary traditions in Europe, especially in Italy. Beans became an important source of protein, while other crops like squash, peppers, avocado, and peanuts contributed to culinary diversity. Cacao, and with it chocolate, would become widely grown in Africa, becoming a luxury item in Europe. And in the New World, wheat and barley became staple grains, especially in North American colonies, and bananas, citrus, apple, grapes, and olives added to the diversity of diets there. Cash crops like sugar, tobacco, and coffee became central to the economies of the colonies in the Americas, fueling the Atlantic slave trade. This was sometimes called the Triangle Trade, under which European powers brought enslaved peoples from West Africa through the Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean to work on sugar plantations in the Caribbean and cotton and tobacco plantations in the American South. The sugar, cotton, and tobacco were then exported back to Europe for processing and consumption. Manufactured goods, especially guns and textiles, as well as rum, were exported to Africa to pay for more slaves, contributing to the maintenance and growth of the entire system. The slave trade had a profound impact on the population of both Africa and the Americas, with millions of Africans forcibly enslaved and moved to the plantation economies of the Americas, and as many as 20% dying along the way. The Columbian Exchange also had a profound impact on the indigenous peoples of the America, as the rampant spread of disease led to tens of millions of deaths, upwards of 95% of the pre-contact population perishing. The Columbian Exchange also had strong environmental impacts, including the introduction of invasive species, which transformed ecological systems, deforestation to clear land for agricultural production, and dramatic changes in land use patterns. And finally, the wealth generated from colonial agriculture, cash crop production, and trade contributed to the rise of European powers and the global spread of capitalism. Beyond the specifics of the Columbian Exchange, colonialism had a profound and lasting impact on food systems globally, reshaping agriculture, diets, economies, and cultures. Colonial powers often forced colonized populations to abandon diverse subsistence farming practices in favor of monoculture production of cash crops. As we just mentioned, colonies in the Caribbean, North America, and South America were transformed into large-scale plantation economies forced on producing cash crops for export. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil became major economic enterprises, heavily reliant on enslaved African labor. In Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, coffee, tea, and cocoa plantations became common, integrating all these regions into global trade networks. This shift usually disrupted traditional food systems, increasing vulnerability to famine and fueling dependence on imported food. Colonial authorities seized vast tracts of land from indigenous communities, often leading to displacement, loss of livelihood, and food insecurity. The extracted resources, including agricultural products, were primarily exported to benefit the colonizing powers, leaving the colonized populations with limited access to their own land and resources. Colonial policies often suppressed indigenous knowledge and practices related to food production, preservation, and consumption. This was a deliberate practice to conquer peoples and territories. Indeed, as Sean Sherman, the Indigenous an Indigenous Oglala Lakota chef, describes it, the most effective way to conquer people is to attack their food systems, burning crops, destroying food storage systems, destroying bison, letting cattle graze on ancient fields. If you can control the food, you can control the people. It's a war tactic. This loss of knowledge and cultural heritage further undermined food security and resilience in colonized communities. At the same time, colonialism established global trade networks that facilitated the movement of food commodities across continents. This globalized food system prioritized profit and efficiency over sustainability and equity, leading to unequal access to food and food resources. It also tended to promote Western diets and food preferences in colonized regions, leading to changes in consumption patterns and dietary habits. This shift towards processed and imported foods often undermined traditional diets and contributed to the rise of diet-related health problems. And in doing so, it shaped food systems worldwide. As a result, many formerly colonized countries still grapple with food insecurity, malnutrition, and unequal access to resources, problems which are often exacerbated by ongoing global economic and political structures that perpetuate power imbalances and inequalities. While food systems around the world were transformed by colonization, food also played a role in the process of resistance and decolonization. Indeed, as colonized nations sought to reclaim their sovereignty and cultural heritage, food became both a practical tool for survival and a powerful symbol in resistance against colonial domination. Colonization often suppressed or marginalized indigenous culinary practices and ingredients. Through decolonization, communities actively reclaimed and revitalized traditional food pathways, reasserting their cultural identity and rejecting the imposed culinary norms of the colonizers. This reclamation involved rediscovering and reviving lost recipes, promoting indigenous ingredients, and celebrating traditional cooking techniques. Examples of this abound, including the Maori hanji, a traditional earth oven cooking method, and the Yurok salmon roast, smoking salmon on sticks over an open pit fire. Food also served as a form of cultural resistance against the homogenizing forces of colonialism. By embracing their unique culinary traditions, communities asserted their distinct identities and resisted attempts to erase or assimilate their cultural heritage. Food became a symbol of pride and a way to connect with ancestors and heritage. Many indigenous communities in North America, such as the Pueblo, Hopi, and Navajo, for example, are actively working to revitalize traditional food systems and diets. This involves cultivating heirloom crops like corns, beans, and squash, restoring traditional farming practices, and promoting the consumption of indigenous foods as part of broader efforts to both improve health outcomes and strengthen cultural identity and sovereignty. In recent years, food has become a key component of promoting food sovereignty and self-determination. Food sovereignty, the right of peoples to define their own food and agricultural systems, was a central theme in decolonization movements. By asserting control over their food production and consumption, communities challenged the exploitative structures of colonialism and reclaimed their right to self-determination. In many countries in the global south, including India, Mexico, and Bolivia, there are vibrant food sovereignty movements that are challenging industrial food systems and advocating for local control over food production and distribution, drawing inspiration from indigenous traditions and practices, promoting agroecology, seed saving, and community-based food systems. Food served as a vehicle for cultural expression and community building in the context of decolonization. Shared meals, festivals, and culinary gatherings provided space for people to connect with their cultural heritage, exchange knowledge, and build solidarity. These events also served as platforms to raise awareness about social justice issues and advocate for political change. This strategy has been employed by a variety of groups, from the Black Panthers in Oakland to the Idle No More movement in Canada, where Indigenous women use community feasts and traditional food sharing as a way to raise awareness of Indigenous land rights and environmental issues. Finally, food has played a role in challenging the dominant narratives and stereotypes associated with colonized cultures. By showcasing the richness and diversity of their culinary traditions, communities countered the often negative or simplistic portrayals imposed by colonizers. This act of culinary storytelling served as a form of cultural resistance and a way to reclaim agency over their own representation. Today, a growing number of Indigenous chefs like Sean Sherman, Inez Cook, Nephi Craig, and many others are using their platforms to promote culinary decolonization. By showcasing Indigenous ingredients and culinary techniques in innovative ways, they are challenging stereotypes, reclaiming their cultural heritage, and contributing to a broader movement for decolonization. Indeed, as Nephi Craig said in a 2022 interview with Craftsmanship magazine, even when you're able to blend into society, there's still a void in our identity. So when we're able to connect with food, we're literally connecting with and embodying our Indigenous identity. But colonization also led to the blending and fusion of culinary traditions from different cultures, resulting in so-called syncretic cuisines. In the context of post-colonialism, syncretic cuisines emerge as powerful symbols of cultural resilience, adaptation, and the complex interplay between Indigenous and colonial influences. They reflect the ways in which formerly colonized societies have navigated and transformed their culinary landscapes. Syncretic cuisines often combine local and introduced ingredients. An example of this might be the use of chili peppers introduced from the Americas in Asian and African dishes. They also involve the blending of cooking methods and techniques from different traditions, such as the combination of European baking techniques with Indigenous ingredients in various pastries and breads, like the popular bunny chow of Durban, South Africa, which consists of an Indian curry served in a hollowed-out loaf of bread. Finally, syncretic cuisines result in the emergence of new, unique dishes that represent the melding of diverse culinary traditions. Examples include the creation of currywurst in Germany, which blends Indian spices with German sausages. There are a large number of syncretic cuisines around the world, the most popular of which include Creole and Cajun cuisines in the American South. Creole and Cajun are a blend of French, Spanish, African, Caribbean, and Native American culinary traditions that include dishes like jambalaya, gumbo, and etouffee. Peranakan cuisine of Malaysia and Singapore is a fusion of Chinese and Malay culinary traditions developed by the Straits Chinese community that includes dishes like laksa, ayam buah keluak, and nasi lemak. Modern Caribbean cuisine blends African, Indigenous, European, particularly British, Spanish, and French, and Indian culinary practices, and includes dishes like jerk chicken, roti, ackee, and saltfish. Modern South African cuisine is a mix of Indigenous African, Dutch, British, Indian, and Malaysian culinary influences, and popular dishes like bobo tea, Cape Malay curry, and the aforementioned bunny chow reflect the syncretic nature of this cuisine. Mozambican peri-peri chicken, popularized in the United States and elsewhere by Nando's Chicken, combines Indigenous African spices with Portuguese flame-grilled cooking techniques. We could go on and on. Syncretic cuisines embody the resilience of colonized people who adapted and integrated foreign elements while preserving their cultural identity. They also represent an assertion of cultural identity. By embracing and celebrating syncretic dishes, post-colonial societies assert their unique cultural identities and histories. Syncretic cuisines challenge the homogenizing forces of globalization by highlighting the rich, diverse culinary traditions that emerged from colonial encounters. They serve as a powerful medium for storytelling, carrying the histories and memories of colonial and post-colonial experiences. And finally, syncretic cuisines can act as a tool for culinary diplomacy, fostering understanding and appreciation between different cultures and communities. Syncretic cuisines differ from the fusion cuisines we've explored in other videos. While fusion cuisine is normally thought of as an intentional and contemporary effort to blend elements of distinct dishes, syncretic cuisines are the result of long-term cultural interactions and historical blendings of cultures. Fusion cuisines generally combine distinct elements from two or more different cultures, each retaining their individual identities. Syncretic cuisine, by contrast, integrates the elements of component cuisines so thoroughly that they create a new, unified culinary tradition. Thus, we might think of dishes like sushi burritos or Korean tacos as examples of fusion cuisine, while culinary traditions like Creole and Peruvian are examples of syncretic cuisines. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching.